Halloween, 1953. It was a cold Halloween on the Canadian prairie, and the snow had been falling all day. That wasn't going to stop the kids from going door to door later that night, however. It did not stop them from having to go to school that day either. Mrs. O'Ryan, everybody's favorite elementary teacher at the small school, she was firm and strict, yet fun and loving. She especially enjoyed when the calendar turned to celebrated days, Halloween being her favorite. Every year, she would put aside the usual teachings of grade 5 and spend the day celebrating Halloween. Yes, Mrs. O'Ryan always looked forward to Halloween with her students. Her classroom was filled with the seasonal spirit. Crepe paper streamers of orange and black crisscrossed the ceiling. Construction paper witches and black cats filled the windows. Cookies and candies and assorted treats spanned the top of the bookshelves. Atop her desk at the front of the room was the largest jack-o'-lantern the kids had ever seen, with a frightening yet welcoming grin that had been carved into it. The desks had all been pushed toward the walls, forming a circle around a large metal tub which had been filled with water and had bright red apples floating on it. It was a rarity in those days to see a store-bought costume. The students would come to class in outfits that were usually homemade from scraps of whatever was handy. Old potato sacks were a favorite choice, and once washed became everything from devils to scarecrows to even werewolves. Bed sheets were a common sight as well, transforming the children into ghosts and ghouls or whatever their vibrant imaginations could think of. Looking at the array of costume ideas, Mrs. O'Ryan often thought that the children had truly known the meaning of Halloween. Maybe it is because the children are the most easily taken that it was somehow inherently part of them to dress in a frightening manner, to make sure they were covered completely in ghoulish pleasure, for that is what Halloween costumes are meant for, to hide from the evil that roams the earth that night. If the spirits think you are one of them, they'll just pass you by. "Oh, children," Mrs. O'Ryan said to her class, "you all look wonderful." She clapped her hands lightly. "Come now, let's form a circle and I'll tell you a Halloween story." The children heeded her word and sat cross-legged on the floor facing Mrs. O'Ryan's desk. There was very little chatter as Mrs. O'Ryan crossed to the door and switched off the lights, leaving the room lit only by a few candles and the large jack-o'-lantern sitting atop her desk. The room became completely silent by the time she walked back to her desk and she sat next to the jack-o'-lantern. "Now, children, I know you're wondering when we will be bobbing for apples," Mrs. O'Ryan addressed the students. Excited murmurs filled the room. "Before we start, it's important to know why we bob for apples at Halloween." The children hushed again as they anticipated the fun about to happen. Halloween, as its name is now, used to be called All Hallows Eve or All Saints Eve. Long before any of us were born, long before there was even a country called Canada, the people discovered that this was the easiest night of the year to contact the spirits of ones crossed over. Through special incantations, that is like magic words, the old religions were able to break through the veil that hangs between the worlds, but only on this one night, Halloween. Now, it wouldn't be Halloween without a creepy tale, would it? So here we go. Mrs. O'Ryan's voice slowly faded to a little more than a whisper as she drew the children's attention. Back in my home country, the people knew that Halloween was the best night to contact the fairy world. Oh, I see some of you smiling at the thought of cute little fairies flitting from flower to flower, but these are not those kind of fairies. No, these are fairies spelled F-A-E-R-I-E. They're not quite as nice as the fairies you are thinking of. The children watched silently as Mrs. O'Ryan walked to the metal tub and lifted an apple out of the water. The red apple glistened as the water dripped back into the tub. Mrs. O'Ryan held the apple to high level and looked at it. The apple, you see, was given as a gift to the fairies and fairies alike. The sweeter the apple, the better the essence, and the better the year the giver would be granted. People even left apples on altars in front of their homes. Fairies were known to be able to be seen in the reflection of pure water, so apples were placed in the tub, and, hoping to see one, The children would keep their eyes open while they grabbed for an apple with their teeth. Some of the children smiled at the thought of being able to see a real fairy. Others stared in disbelief. Mrs. Orion continued, "Only the purest of heart, mind you, will be able to see a fairy. On the other hand, an unpure heart may be able to see a different being, a fairy called Slaw Namois, or translated host of the dead. He is an evil fae known for hunting children about your ages and flying them high into the sky and dropping them to their doom. They were the children unlucky enough to be born to non-believers, children who had never been baptized into any religion, any truth. Some young victims are simply taken from their parents and flown to a lonely island somewhere. Others are forced to shoot arrows into one they love, while the slaw watched on, laughing." The children watched silently as Mrs. Orion placed the apple back into the water. "I saw one once," she said, "a slaw. It was many years ago. It was because I had taken an apple from an offering altar on our neighbor's porch. I was just a child. I didn't know any better. I was a lucky one and got away by running home, and my ma closed all the windows. Closing every window and every door will help keep it out. That is why some people are wary to open the door to trick-or-treaters. They wonder if it is really just a child on the other side of the door." I still remember the smell, the horrible rotten stench from the slaw as it tried to find a way into our house. I could hear it, maybe only in my head, but I could hear it. "I will see you again one day," it said to me. "I will come for you again." My ma heard the stories of the slaw and knew what to do. I had needed to be baptized so the slaw would leave me alone. So that very evening, after she was sure it was safe, she took me to the church and baptized me herself with the holy water. Even though the slaw had yelled at me that I couldn't escape his pain, I have never seen him since. I trust that my mother's baptizing me helped. The children were noticeably frightened as she concluded her story. So you see, bobbing for apples is more than just a game. It is an important ritual as ancient as time itself. Remember that when you are knocking on doors tonight. Remember to say Halloween apples as an appeasement to the fairies. As I said before, I didn't know any better, but now you do. The children were frozen still at the thought of the slaw. Silence filled the room and was broken when Tommy McDonald spoke. "That was a great story, Mrs. Orion. I really liked it." The other children murmured in agreement. "Well, thank you, kids," Mrs. Orion smiled. "Okay, so now who wants to bob for apples?" Mrs. Orion clapped her hands as she walked to the power switch to relight the room. "That was really scary," Tommy McDonald said as he looked around the room with wide eyes. Mrs. Orion walked to Tommy and ruffled his hair. She didn't care who knew it, but Tommy was her favorite student. "Gee, it was just a story, Tommy," Brenda Carter said in a snide way. "I want to bob for apples now." Okay, Mrs. Ryan said. "Who wants to go first?" "Me first. I want to see a fairy," Brenda said. Brenda pressed her face deep into the water and came up with a bright red apple clenched in her teeth. Pouted as she said, "Darn, I didn't see a thing." The next kid, the next apple, and still no fairies were reported to be seen. Myrna Henderson screamed with joy when she came out of the water. I saw one! I saw one!" The class laughed. Mrs. Orion loved her Halloween day more than the kids did. She loved the excitement it brought to the kids, and being able to get that story off her chest every year was cathartic. As healing as it was, it never removed the pain of having to shoot an arrow into her father while the creature watched from above. She always left that part of the story out. The children did not need to hear that awful detail. He had survived the arrow, but Mrs. Orion was never able to get the image completely from her mind. It was after her mother bandaged her father that she was taken to the church to be baptized. It was from inside the church she had heard the slow holler that he would return for her. "Your ma is no true believer. This baptism is a joke," it laughed. "I will come back for you." The children really didn't need those details. but it was so important that she was able to tell this story one more time and hopefully save another child from this evil slaw. No one but herself knew that the tub was actually filled with holy water, and as each child playfully searched for an apple in the water, she said a silent prayer of baptism. She, Mrs. Orion, a true believer in God and Jesus and the saints and the apostles, would silently and wholeheartedly say this prayer. There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and one God who is Father of all, over all, through all, and within all. The prayer was an important one, needed to protect each of these innocent souls. Without it, the baptism was meaningless. Only 2 more children in her care needed to be baptized this Halloween, Michael Sutherland and Tommy MacDonald. Michael had accidentally taken a bit of water into his throat as he searched for the apple and began to choke slightly. Mrs. Orion ran to him and gently patted his back as his coughing slowly subsided. For the first time in these many years, Mrs. Orion had gotten distracted during the ritual and missed Tommy MacDonald placing his face into the water. No prayer of baptism was said. "Oh, please, please, Lord, let the holy water have been enough," Mrs. Orion yelled in fear as she saw Tommy's head pull up from the water. Maybe, she thought, please God, maybe he had been baptized as a baby. He hadn't been. Tommy flipped his head hard back out of the water. The water droplets from his hair formed an arch above him and hung silently in midair. Tommy's head continued to throw back as the apple in his mouth glistened bright and red. The water droplets moved to form a perfect circle above the tub of water and floating apples. "I saw something," Tommy screamed at the top of his lungs. "I saw some..." Tommy was unable to finish his last sentence before a large talon came through the circle of suspended droplets and grabbed the apple that had been clenched between Tommy's teeth. A second talon grabbed Tommy by ripping into his chest and pulled him through the circle. Tommy disappeared and the droplets fell to the ground. Time had no meaning at this point, as an instant later, Mrs. Orion fell to the floor, having been pierced by a fiery arrow that still burned as it protruded from her gasping lung. Screaming, terrified children fled the room and the school. "I told you I would come for you again." A deep voice filled the air as talons grabbed Mrs. Orion's body and disappeared with it. Outside the open window, a pale, wet, and crying Tommy MacDonald shivered in the snow as he stood with an archer's bow in his hand.